Late May 1944. Observation Post, Pointe du Hoc. Normandy coast occupied France. From the edge of a reinforced concrete bunker carved into the cliffs, Oberleutnant Frido Ebling scanned the channel through his field glasses. Below him, nearly 100 feet straight down, pale limestone walls plunged toward a narrow strip of sand battered endlessly by the sea. The cliff face offered no natural ledges, no shelter, only bare rock descending into the surf. A thin veil of morning fog hovered over the water, dissolving the horizon into grey uncertainty. Somewhere beyond that haze lay England, and with it, the massive Allied armada that everyone knew was coming. It was no longer a question of if, only where. Behind Ebling, the sounds of routine carried through the bunker complex. Young artillerymen from the 2nd Battery of Army Coastal Artillery Battalion 1260 moved through their morning checks with practiced calm. Ammunition was inspected, weapons cleaned, positions manned. Confidence was not merely encouraged here, it was assumed. This cliff was believed to be unassailable. Ebling lowered the binoculars and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. From his vantage point, the logic was undeniable. No attacking force could climb these cliffs while under sustained fire. Any enemy attempting such madness would be annihilated before reaching the top. From a purely mechanical perspective, angles, gravity, exposure, the outcome was predetermined. Physics itself favored the defender. The cliff face rose nearly vertically, defended by overlapping machine gun coverage and manned by roughly 200 experienced soldiers drawn from the 716th and 352nd Infantry Divisions. Inland approaches were sealed with dense minefields, barbed wire entanglements, and prepared firing positions. Every standard military assessment confirmed what intuition already suggested: an assault from the sea was impossible. And yet, within days, that certainty would be tested by an American operation so daring that it would permanently alter assumptions about what infantry could achieve under fire. The German belief in Pointe du Hoc's invulnerability was not new. It stretched back to June 1940, immediately after France's collapse, when Wehrmacht engineers first evaluated the promontory. The rock formation thrust be named Utah and Omaha beaches, commanding vast arcs of fire in all directions. Artillery placed here could strike landing forces miles away, long before they reached shore. By late 1942, 6 captured French 155mm GPF artillery pieces had been installed atop the cliffs. Each weapon could launch a shell weighing nearly 100 pounds across distances approaching 11 miles. 4 of the guns sat in exposed concrete emplacements, while 2 were in the process of being sealed inside enormous 671 casemates, reinforced structures specifically engineered to survive naval bombardment and aerial attack. The scale of construction alone reflected German confidence that this position would never fall. That confidence was reinforced at the highest levels. In March 1944, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, serving as Inspector General of Atlantic Wall Defenses, personally visited Pointe du Hoc. His observations were recorded in a diary entry later recovered from German archives decades after the war. Rommel's assessment was blunt and characteristically precise. The natural terrain provided stronger protection than any artificial fortification could offer. An attack from the sea, he concluded, was tactically unworkable. Any real danger would come from airborne troops or an inland thrust. By the spring of 1944, Pointe du Hoc had become a fully integrated fortress complex. It featured an X-636 observation bunker with uninterrupted views of the coastline, multiple L-409 mounts for 20mm anti-aircraft weapons, and roughly 30 flak guns defending against air attack. Trenches and tunnels linked firing positions, ammunition stores were embedded directly into the rock, and defensive belts extended inland in every direction. The garrison consisted of approximately 125 infantrymen from the 726th Grenadier Regiment of the 716th Infantry Division, supported by 85 artillery specialists from Coastal Artillery Battalion 1260. Additional forces from the 352nd Infantry Division were positioned nearby as mobile reserves. Morale among the defenders was high. In a letter dated May 28, 1944, one soldier assigned to the Eastern Defensive Sector wrote to his wife with unshakable confidence. He described Pointe du Hoc as the strongest position on the entire Atlantic Wall, insisting that any American force daring to approach would meet only death beneath the cliffs. The men, he wrote, believed the rock itself was their greatest weapon. Allied planners, reviewing the same terrain, reached grim conclusions of their own. Any unit attempting to scale the cliffs would remain fully exposed for at least 15 minutes, possibly twice that if ropes failed, ladders shifted, or men lost their grip. During that time, defenders could fire straight down onto attackers who had no cover, no room to maneuver, and almost no way to respond. German defensive doctrine accounted for every angle. Machine gun nests were placed at regular intervals along the cliff edge, ensuring continuous overlapping fire with no blind spots. Grenades could simply be dropped onto climbing troops. Even loose stones dislodged and pushed over the edge would become deadly weapons by the time they reached the beach. On paper, the equation was flawless. The fortress could not be taken from the sea. History would soon prove that equations, no matter how precise, cannot fully account for human resolve. German planners defending the Atlantic Wall believed that simple arithmetic favored the defense. One officer estimated that during a frontal assault, a single well-positioned soldier could incapacitate or kill as many as 10 attackers. By that logic, a garrison of 200 men might theoretically cause up to 2,000 casualties before being overrun. On paper, the numbers appeared reassuring. Yet on the opposite side of the English Channel, Allied commanders were running their own calculations and reaching far more troubling conclusions. Inside the tightly secured briefing rooms of Allied Supreme Headquarters in London, the outline of Operation Overlord was steadily taking form. As intelligence reports accumulated, one location along the Normandy coast emerged as a critical threat: Pointe du Hoc. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, serving as Supreme Allied Commander, and his senior staff identified the position as one of the most dangerous German strongpoints guarding the invasion beaches. If its 6 155mm artillery pieces remained operational on the morning of D-Day, they could deliver devastating fire onto both Utah Beach to the west and Omaha Beach to the east. From that elevated vantage point, a single battery could shatter landing craft, destroy armored vehicles before they reached dry land, and transform narrow stretches of sand into lethal bottlenecks. From a purely operational standpoint, the invasion could not succeed unless the guns at Pointe du Hoc were neutralized in advance. That responsibility ultimately fell to General Omar Bradley, commander of the U.S. First Army and the officer in charge of the American landing zones. Bradley quickly realized that none of the conventional solutions offered a reliable answer. The cliffs were too steep and too heavily defended for a standard infantry landing. Airborne troops might be dropped inland to strike from the rear, but the dense Norman hedgerows made coordination and movement unpredictable. Naval bombardment and aerial strikes could damage surface installations, but the reinforced concrete gun casemates were specifically engineered to withstand such punishment. Only one plan promised certainty, and it violated nearly every accepted rule of amphibious warfare. A small assault force would land directly beneath the cliffs, climb nearly 100 feet of exposed rock while under fire, and eliminate the gun positions through close-quarters combat. When Bradley presented this mission to Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder on February 3, 1944, his unease was unmistakable. Rudder, a 34-year-old reserve officer from Brady, Texas, commanded the 2nd Ranger Battalion, an elite unit of 545 men selected and trained for unusually hazardous operations. Standing over the map table, Bradley did not soften his words. Naval planners, he explained, believed the mission was impossible. One officer had reportedly remarked that even 3 elderly women with brooms could prevent attackers from scaling those cliffs. Rudder carefully examined the reconnaissance photographs spread before him. The images revealed sheer rock faces rising abruptly from a narrow strip of beach, gun emplacements positioned to dominate the approaches, and defensive trenches running along the cliff edge. After a long moment, he looked up and delivered a quiet but resolute response that would later become legendary. "My men can do it, sir." What followed was a planning process unlike any undertaken before. Companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, 225 soldiers in total, were designated Force A and tasked with the direct assault on Pointe du Hoc. They would be backed by the 5th Ranger Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Max Schneider, and assigned as Force C. If the initial assault succeeded, Schneider's men would land to reinforce the position. If it failed, they would divert to Omaha Beach. H hour was set for 6:30 a.m. On D-Day, with naval fire support provided by the battleship USS Texas and the destroyers USS Satterley and HMS Talibont. Despite the detailed planning, one question dominated every discussion. How could men climb a vertical cliff while defenders above them actively tried to kill them? Beginning in April 1944, the Rangers trained intensively along the cliffs near Swanage on England's southern coast. British commandos, veterans of daring coastal raids in Norway and occupied France, shared their hard-earned expertise in cliff assault operations. They were blunt about the reality of the task. As one British officer explained during training, climbing under enemy fire bore little resemblance to sport climbing. The real danger was not the rock face itself, but the soldiers waiting above. Speed, he warned, was the only possible protection, and even that might not be enough. The Rangers experimented relentlessly, testing every method they could imagine. Eventually, they adopted rocket-fired grappling hooks, small rockets attached to ropes and metal hooks that could be launched upward, dragging the line over the cliff edge where it might snag on rocks or fortifications. By firing multiple ropes, they created a web of ascent routes. Training was repeated dozens of times throughout April and May. First Sergeant Leonard Lomell, a 24-year-old platoon leader from Point Pleasant Beach, New Jersey, chronicled the experience in letters home. He wrote of endless climbs and sleepless nights, of practicing with soaked ropes to simulate the conditions of a channel crossing, and of the danger posed by wet lines that became slick as ice. Falls were common, though serious injuries were rare. Soon the Rangers trained wearing full combat loads, nearly 60 pounds of weapons, ammunition, and equipment. From these exercises, a refined system emerged. Selected climbers would ascend first, carrying minimal gear and light weapons, establishing a foothold at the top to suppress defenders. Heavier troops followed, hauling automatic weapons and explosives. The strongest men were assigned Browning automatic rifles to provide immediate firepower once the cliff was breached. Each Ranger company was also issued thermite grenades, specialized incendiary devices that burned at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Their purpose was precise: to destroy artillery by melting firing mechanisms and permanently fusing steel components. If the Rangers reached the guns, they would ensure they could never be fired again. By early June 1944, the mission was set. Success depended on speed, surprise, and extraordinary courage. Failure was expected by many. Yet the Rangers prepared to attempt what no army had ever tried before: scaling a fortress cliff under fire to change the course of the largest amphibious invasion in history. On the evening before the invasion, as the Rangers prepared to depart for France, their commanding officer, Colonel James Rudder, gathered the men for one final address. It was June 4, 1944. And there was no attempt to soften the reality of what lay ahead. He spoke plainly. The enemy, he explained, would be positioned high above them, protected by concrete, rock, and fortified cover. German troops would look down on the Rangers with unobstructed firing lines. The assaults would require climbing sheer cliffs while burdened with weapons and equipment, suspended on ropes, fully exposed and unable to take shelter. He made it clear that casualties were inevitable. Some would never reach the top, and others would not live to see the end of the day. Yet Rudder left no doubt about his confidence in the men before him. He reminded them that no unit on Earth was better prepared for the task. For 3 months they had trained relentlessly for this single objective. They understood the terrain, trusted their weapons, and, most importantly, trusted one another. When they reached the beach, he said, they would scale the cliffs with a speed the defenders would not anticipate. They would arrive at the summit before the Germans could stop them all. And once there, the mission would be completed. The artillery threatening the invasion beaches would be destroyed and the landings would succeed. When Rudder asked if they were ready, the reply came instantly from more than 200 voices: "Rangers, lead the way." Before dawn on June 6, 1944, the crossing of the English Channel began. At 4:45 a.m., Rangers boarded their landing craft from the transport ship HMS Amsterdam. Darkness still covered the sea, and the weather was already working against them. The waves were rough, far worse than anything encountered during training. Each landing craft assault vessel carried 22 men. 9 LCAs made up the main assault force, supported by 2 additional craft loaded with supplies. 4 amphibious DUKW trucks followed, each carrying extended ladders, some reaching nearly 100 feet, provided by the London Fire Brigade. As the vessels pushed forward, waves rose to 5 and even 6 feet, tossing the small craft violently. Many Rangers became desperately seasick in the cramped pitching boats. Private First Class Harry Fate of E Company later recalled how quickly conditions deteriorated. Within minutes of leaving the ship, the men were already drenched as seawater poured over the low sides of the craft. Some vomited uncontrollably, while others worked frantically to bail water to keep the boat afloat. In every direction, barely visible in the darkness, stretched thousands of ships, an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen. As dawn approached, the sky began to brighten in the east. At 5:50 a.m., the naval bombardment of Pointe du Hoc commenced. The battleship USS Texas, positioned roughly 10,000 yards offshore, opened fire with its massive 14-inch guns. Each shell weighed nearly 1,400 pounds. They tore through the air overhead and slammed into the clifftop, sending shockwaves through the ground and throwing columns of earth and shattered concrete into the sky. Over the next 34 minutes, USS Texas fired a total of 255 shells, maintaining a punishing pace of more than 7 rounds per minute. American destroyers, including the Satterlee and the Talbot, joined the attack with their 5-inch guns. From their landing craft, the Rangers watched as the cliffs appeared to erupt continuously under the bombardment. But even as the bombardment continued, the operation was already going wrong. Amid the darkness, spray, and confusion at sea, the lead navigation craft made a critical error. Lieutenant Colin Beaver of the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, responsible for guiding the flotilla, had drifted off course. Instead of steering directly toward Pointe du Hoc, the assault force was unknowingly traveling parallel to the coastline, moving toward Pointe de la Percy, nearly 3 miles to the east. First Sergeant Leonard Lomell was among the first to realize something was wrong. Peering through the mist and seawater at the cliffs ahead, he noticed that the rock formations did not match what they had studied. Forcing his way across the packed landing craft, he shouted over the engine noise to the British coxswain that they were heading for the wrong objective. Eventually, others recognized the mistake. Lieutenant Beaver acknowledged the error and ordered an immediate correction, but valuable time had already been lost. The landing, scheduled for H hour at 6:30 a.m., would not reach the beach until after 7 a.m. The consequences were serious. Instead of climbing under the limited cover of early morning light, the Rangers would now be fully exposed in broad daylight. Worse still, the delay meant that roughly 40 minutes would pass between the end of the naval bombardment and the start of the assault, giving German defenders precious time to recover, regroup, and return to their firing positions. Meanwhile, Company C of the 2nd Ranger Battalion, assigned to attack Pointe de la Percée, landed at the correct location around 6:40 a.m. Captain Ralph Goranson led approximately 70 men up the cliffs, successfully securing their objective. However, they were now isolated, separated from the main assault force by 3 miles of enemy-controlled coastline. Offshore, the 4th and 5th Ranger Battalions waited anxiously. Their orders were clear: they would advance only after receiving confirmation that Pointe du Hoc had been captured. That signal never came. What followed would become one of the most perilous and legendary assaults of the Second World War. Following direct orders from higher command, Lieutenant Colonel Schneider faced a decision he knew would carry serious consequences. The original operation had assigned his force of roughly 500 soldiers to support what planners believed would be a successful assault at Pointe du Hoc. However, a delay of nearly 40 minutes disrupted that plan entirely. Instead of reinforcing the ranges at the cliffs, Schneider's men were redirected toward Omaha Beach, where they would come ashore in the WWII sector. This unexpected change altered the course of two battles at once. At Omaha Beach, Schneider's troops would become involved in a separate fight, one that would later prove critical to breaking through German defenses on what became the most lethal of the Normandy landing zones. But the cost of that decision was severe. The 225 Rangers assigned to Force A would now attack Pointe du Hoc alone, without the reinforcements originally promised. At approximately 7:10 a.m., the landing craft carrying Force A finally adjusted course and headed toward their true objective. Ahead of them, the cliffs of Pointe du Hoc emerged from the morning haze, sheer, towering walls of limestone and chalk rising abruptly from the sea. The rock face bore the scars of heavy naval bombardment, riddled with craters and shattered stone. Smoke drifted lazily from the remains of German bunkers at the top, giving the impression that the bombardment had done its work. At the base of the cliffs lay a narrow strip of beach, no more than 30 yards wide at low tide. The ground was chaotic, strewn with rocks, debris, and deep bomb craters that made movement difficult and dangerous. From that narrow shoreline, the cliff rose almost vertically for nearly 100 feet, offering little natural cover. The first landing craft, LCA 8888, scraped onto the beach, carrying Colonel James Rudder and members of E Company. As the ramp dropped into knee-deep water, Rudder immediately leapt forward, sprinting toward the base of the cliff. Almost instantly, intense machine gun fire erupted from German positions along the cliff edge. Any hope that the defenders had been neutralized by the bombardment vanished. The German troops were not only alive, they were organized, alert, and fully prepared to fight. Lieutenant James Eatner, the last man to exit LCA 888, later recalled the moment in vivid detail. He remembered charging through shallow water toward what felt like a distant wall of rock, though in reality it was no more than 50 to 70 yards away. As bullets cracked through the air around him, men fell before reaching the cliff. His only thought, he later said, was to reach the base of the cliff, believing that once there the Germans would no longer be able to fire directly downward. Along a front stretching roughly 500 yards, 9 landing craft unloaded their Ranger teams almost simultaneously. Rocket-fired grappling hooks were launched without delay. Trails of smoke and flame marked their ascent as the rockets pulled ropes upward toward the cliff top. Some ropes, soaked with seawater, failed to reach their mark and slid back down the rock face. Others caught on jagged edges, and Rangers immediately began the perilous climb. The assault equipment meant to assist them offered little help. Extension ladders carried on amphibious WWIIs could not be positioned properly. The heavy bombardment had transformed the beach into a cratered wasteland, preventing vehicles from approaching close enough to the cliff base to be useful. German resistance intensified rapidly. Machine gun fire swept across both the beach and the cliff face. MG-42 seconds, capable of firing more than 1,000 rounds per minute, created near-continuous streams of bullets. Grenades were hurled from above, exploding among the climbing Rangers, while defenders simply pushed large rocks over the edge. Blocks of limestone weighing up to 20 pounds became lethal weapons when dropped from a height of 100 feet. Several Rangers were struck and knocked from their ropes, plunging back toward the beach. Despite this, the Rangers below and those still aboard the landing craft returned fire relentlessly. Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, and Montgarins hammered any German soldier who exposed himself at the cliff edge. At the same time, U.S. Navy destroyers USS Satterlee and USS Taliban maneuvered dangerously close to shore. Their 5-inch guns opened fire on active bunkers and firing positions, providing critical suppressive support. Gradually, the balance began to shift. German defenders found it increasingly difficult to maintain fire on the climbers without revealing their positions and drawing devastating return fire from below and offshore. At approximately 7:25 a.m., just 15 minutes after the initial landing, the first Rangers reached the top of the cliffs. Among them was Sergeant Haywood Roby of E Company. As he pulled himself over the edge, he immediately encountered 3 German soldiers preparing to throw grenades downward. Roby opened fire with his Thompson submachine gun at close range, killing all 3 before they could act. Other German troops quickly withdrew from the exposed edge, retreating into a maze of trenches and reinforced positions inland. Within minutes, roughly 30 Rangers from D&E companies had secured a fragile foothold on the cliff top. But the sense of triumph was brief. As the men advanced toward the heavily reinforced gun emplacements fighting through rubble, shell holes, and shattered concrete, they made a discovery that stunned them. The casemates were empty. Where intelligence had promised 6 massive 155mm artillery guns, the Rangers found only wooden poles, crude decoys painted to resemble real weapons from aerial reconnaissance. The artillery pieces that had justified the entire operation were gone. Lieutenant Eichner, reaching one of the emplacements moments later, recalled the disbelief that washed over him. After scaling a vertical cliff under murderous fire and watching friends fall, the realization that the guns were missing felt almost unbearable. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the mission and the sacrifices made had been meaningless. But the reality was more complex. The guns had not vanished, they had merely been relocated. And wherever they were, they still posed a deadly threat to the invasion beaches below. Colonel Rudder, now atop the cliffs and establishing a command post near the point's edge, acted immediately. With limited men and heavy casualties, he reorganized his forces under fire. The objective had changed, but the mission was far from over. His orders were direct and unmistakable. Find the guns. They cannot be far away. Destroy them wherever you locate them. The assault on Pointe du Hoc had not ended. It had entered its most critical phase. By 7:45 in the morning, Ranger units from all 3 assault companies had finally pulled themselves onto the high ground. The achievement came at an appalling price. Out of the 225 men who had stormed ashore, roughly 35 had already been killed or wounded during the climb itself, cut down on the beach or while scaling the cliffs. Another 15 fell after reaching the summit. In effect, fewer than 180 Rangers remained operational, tasked with objectives originally planned for a force of battalion strength. Companies D and E immediately moved away from the cliff edge and began establishing blocking positions along the coastal road. This action followed their original orders: sever the highway and prevent German forces from shifting troops and equipment between Utah and Omaha beaches. Despite suffering from his own injuries, Staff Sergeant Len Lomell personally guided his platoon into position astride the road roughly 200 meters south of Pointe du Hoc. By approximately 8:15 a.m., around 35 Rangers from companies D and E had formed a defensive line controlling the highway. While observing the area, Lomell and his closest companion, Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn, who was serving as acting platoon sergeant, noticed something unusual. A narrow dirt lane branched off from the coastal road and ran inland. The ground was deeply scarred with fresh wheel ruts, suggesting recent movement by heavy equipment. Both men reached the same conclusion independently. These tracks could only belong to the missing German artillery. Without waiting for instructions, relying instead on experience and instinct, the 2 non-commissioned officers decided to investigate. Shortly before 8:45 a.m., Lomell and Kuhn slipped into the sunken lane. Like many Norman farm paths, it was flanked on both sides by dense hedgerows rising nearly 9 feet high. Advancing cautiously, they used bounding movement, one man moving while the other covered, carefully closing the distance step by step. After roughly 250 yards, Lomell suddenly halted. Through a break in the hedgerow, he had spotted something unmistakable. Turning toward Kuhn, he whispered words that would echo through Ranger history. "Jack, there they are. We found them. The goddamn guns." Hidden among apple trees and draped in camouflage netting stood 5 of the 6 missing 155mm howitzers. They were emplaced as a firing battery, barrels aimed northwest toward Utah Beach. Ammunition lay stacked nearby, ready for use. Astonishingly, no German soldiers were guarding the guns at that moment. Across an open field roughly 100 meters away, Lomell observed nearly 100 German troops, likely artillery crews and security personnel, standing together in what appeared to be an organized formation. They were completely unaware that 2 American Rangers were within lethal range of their weapons. Lomell understood the urgency immediately. Between them, he and Kuhn carried only 2 thermite grenades. That would not be sufficient to permanently destroy all 5 artillery pieces, but there was no time to withdraw and wait. Every passing minute increased the risk that the battery would begin firing on the invasion beaches. Lomell made his decision on the spot. "Give me your grenade, Jack." "Cover me, I'll disable them." While Kuhn remained behind with his Thompson submachine gun at the ready, Lomell crawled toward the first howitzer. He placed a thermite grenade directly into the recoil assembly, the critical mechanism that absorbed the force of firing and pulled the pin. The grenade burned without explosion, releasing a torrent of molten metal at temperatures exceeding 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The liquid metal flowed into the machinery, welding components together and rendering the system useless. Moving quickly, Lomell placed Kuhn's grenade into the traversing mechanism of a second gun and activated it. With no grenades left, he improvised. Removing his field jacket, he wrapped it around the butt of his Thompson and methodically smashed the optical aiming sights on all 5 howitzers. These precision instruments could not be replaced under combat conditions. Without them, accurate fire was impossible. The entire operation lasted less than 10 minutes. Lomell and Kuhn then withdrew as quietly as they had arrived. But the job was only partially done. While several guns were disabled, the Rangers needed to ensure they could never be repaired. Upon returning to their roadblock, Lomell immediately began collecting unused thermite grenades from other Rangers. Most had not yet employed theirs. Within minutes, his jacket was filled with grenades. Without hesitation, Lomell and Kuhn set off once more toward the orchard. They reached the artillery position around 9 a.m. Once again, against all odds, the German guns stood unattended. As the mission progressed, one of the soldiers assumed a covering position while Lomell systematically placed thermite charges on the 3 artillery pieces he had previously incapacitated, ensuring their complete neutralization. After carefully securing the explosives, he activated the fuses and began to pull back. The moment he and his companion attempted to descend the 9-foot hedge, an immense explosion erupted. The force of the detonation hurled both men from the hedge into the recessed roadway below. Shrapnel, soil, fragments of equipment, and shell casings rained down in every direction. For a brief period, they lay stunned, unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of what had just occurred. Unbeknownst to them, Sergeant Frank Rapinski, leading a patrol from E Company, had discovered a large German ammunition stockpile near the artillery positions and had destroyed it with grenades. The resulting blast had been far more catastrophic than anyone expected. At 9:05 a.m., Lomell dispatched a runner back to Colonel Rudder with a report that would determine the ultimate outcome of the Pointe du Hoc mission. All enemy guns located had been successfully destroyed. Technically, the mission had been achieved. Colonel Rudder allowed himself a fleeting sense of accomplishment, though the stark reality of their situation quickly reasserted itself. The 175 Rangers remaining were isolated atop a cliff, encircled by German forces whose numbers were unknown. Supplies were dwindling, particularly ammunition, and no immediate reinforcements were in sight. Throughout June 6th, German attempts to reclaim the area intensified. Elements of the 914th Grenadier Regiment probed the Rangers' positions. Mortars relentlessly pounded the defensive roadblocks, while snipers established concealed positions in the surrounding hedges. A heavily reinforced concrete observation bunker, which had withstood the initial naval bombardment, continued to harbor German defenders. Rangers launched bazooka rounds and grenades through the narrow firing slits, yet the occupants refused to surrender. As night fell, Colonel Rudder faced a profoundly difficult command choice. Of the original 225 men, over a third were either killed or wounded, though many of the injured continued to fight. Communication with the coastal highway roadblock remained sporadic. Ammunition levels were critically low, particularly grenades and mortar rounds. German forces maintained control of the surrounding high ground and appeared poised for a major counteroffensive. British Commando Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Trevor, present as an observer with the Rangers, later reflected with understated gravity that he had never been more certain he would either be captured or killed by morning. The night of June 6th-7th became a relentless struggle for survival. German counterattacks came in successive waves, illuminated by flares that lit the night sky while machine gun tracers crisscrossed the darkness. Exhausted from both the climb and continuous fighting, the Rangers took turns maintaining watch. Around 11 p.m., a larger assault developed. German infantry, estimated at company strength, advanced from the south toward the roadblock positions, preceded by mortar fire. The attack unfolded in short, calculated rushes. Rangers responded with disciplined, controlled bursts from their Browning automatic rifles, while grenades flew through the night. The enemy advanced within 50 meters of the positions before finally being repelled, though at the cost of 6 additional Rangers dead and 10 more wounded. Mortar supplies were almost depleted, leaving the 60mm with only a few remaining rounds. On June 7th, German pressure intensified further. Multiple counterattacks emerged simultaneously, supported by reinforcements including elements of the 352nd Infantry Division. The coastal highway roadblock, now reinforced with 23 Rangers from the 5th Battalion who had managed to reach it the previous evening, numbered roughly 85 men and faced the threat of encirclement. The command post on Pointe du Hoc, defending against assaults from the west, held about 90 men, many injured. Colonel Rudder, himself wounded twice during combat, confronted the critical decision of whether to consolidate his forces into a single defensive position or maintain both locations despite the severe risk. He elected to hold both positions, adhering to the mission's directive to control the coastal road and to continue resisting until relief or destruction. This choice exemplified both tactical necessity and the ethos of the Rangers. German assaults continued relentlessly throughout June 7th. Previously bypassed machine gun nests now opened fire from unexpected angles, while snipers operated from concealed locations. Rangers discovered interconnected enemy positions via tunnels and trenches, enabling defenders to appear and vanish unpredictably. By evening, the situation was dire, ammunition nearly exhausted, all 60mm mortar rounds spent and grenades gone. Some Rangers were down to their final rifle clips. Water and medical supplies were critically low, with the wounded receiving only minimal treatment in improvised aid stations. The night of June 7th-8th marked the crisis point. Around midnight, a coordinated German attack, estimated at battalion strength, struck the Ranger positions. The assault began with artillery preparation, followed by massed infantry advancing behind the bombardment. The Rangers, conserving every remaining round, held fire until the enemy approached within 50 meters. The ensuing defense was devastatingly effective, though casualties were severe. First Sergeant Lomell, defending a section of the roadblock, was reduced to 3 rounds in his Thompson and a single grenade. When German soldiers closed to 20 meters, he exhausted his remaining ammunition, deployed his last grenade, then seized an own rifle from a fallen comrade to continue fighting. The attack ultimately faltered less than 10 meters from the Ranger lines. German forces withdrew, leaving behind scores of dead and wounded. When the Rangers accounted for their remaining weapons, they had approximately 100 rounds collectively across all units, underscoring the extremity of their situation. On the morning of June 8th, Pointe du Hoc fell into an unsettling calm. The German forces, though far from defeated, had temporarily ceased their attacks, likely regrouping in anticipation of what they expected to be a decisive strike. The American Rangers stationed there were running dangerously low on ammunition and physically drained, aware that they might be facing their final confrontation. Around midday, scouts stationed at Pointe du Hoc detected movement to the east along the coastal road. For a fleeting moment, the Rangers feared a renewed German offensive, one that they lacked the resources to resist. Relief came when the approaching troops were identified as Americans. Soldiers of the 5th Battalion, reinforced by elements of the 116th Infantry Regiment and armored support from the 743rd Tank Battalion, were advancing from Omaha Beach to relieve the isolated Rangers. The scene the reinforcements encountered was shocking even to experienced combat veterans. The terrain was heavily scarred by artillery and bomb craters. The Rangers who had held the cliffs for 2 days emerged battered and unrecognizable, their uniforms soaked with mud, smeared with blood and streaked with gunpowder residue. Many were wounded, or were utterly exhausted. Upon accounting for survivors, the cost of the operation became painfully clear. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed on D-Day, only 90 remained capable of combat. Yet despite these staggering losses, the mission had succeeded. The 6 155mm coastal guns were destroyed, and the vital coastal road was severed. By holding their positions against overwhelming odds, the Rangers prevented German forces from moving freely between the beaches at the most critical moment of the invasion, demonstrating remarkable tactical skill and steadfast determination. The implications of the Pointe du Hoc engagement extended well beyond the immediate battlefield. The elimination of the heavy artillery pieces neutralized a threat that could have inflicted catastrophic losses on both Utah and Omaha beaches during the invasion's most vulnerable hours. Fire control calculations suggested that, had the guns remained operational and accurately directed, they might have destroyed numerous landing craft and inflicted thousands of casualties on the incoming forces. Cutting the coastal highway also denied German mobile reserves the ability to reinforce either beach, a factor that could have reversed the momentum of the invasion. The 914th Grenadier Regiment, committed to counterattacking the position, was rendered unavailable for any intervention at Omaha Beach, where the battle's outcome remained uncertain for much of June 6. The successful seizure of Pointe du Hoc reinforced General Eisenhower's confidence in the effectiveness of specialized troops and unconventional tactics over standard battlefield doctrine. In his 1948 memoirs, Eisenhower praised the Rangers' actions, highlighting how their courage, initiative, and determination enabled them to overcome formidable defensive positions despite material disadvantages. General Omar Bradley echoed this sentiment in his 1951 Reflections, stressing that the challenges faced by the young commander of the Provisional Ranger Force were unparalleled in difficulty. Bradley emphasized that the Rangers' achievement represented more than just tactical victory. It was evidence of the capacity of well-led and motivated American soldiers to accomplish what seemed impossible. Despite the attention and accolades from senior commanders, the Rangers themselves remained modest in their assessments. Decades later, in oral histories, surviving members consistently attributed their success to rigorous training, coordinated teamwork, and fortuitous circumstances rather than to individual acts of heroism. Their efforts, however, had a lasting impact. The destruction of the guns, the interruption of German movements, and the holding of strategic terrain contributed significantly to the broader success of the Normandy landings, demonstrating First Sergeant Leonard Lomell, who earned the Distinguished Service Cross, the British Military Medal, and the French Legion of Honor for his actions in neutralizing the enemy artillery, always emphasized that his achievements were not unique. In a 1999 interview, he stated plainly that any Ranger in the unit had been trained to execute the same mission. He credited his comrades. Jack provided covering fire, other Rangers established the roadblock that allowed the assault to move inland, and naval bombardments prevented German reinforcements from interfering. Lomell insisted that the success belonged to the entire battalion rather than any individual, especially given the heavy losses they endured. The honors, he believed, should never overshadow the memory of those who never returned. The landscape of Pointe du Hoc remains largely as it was during the assault, maintained as a living memorial to the Rangers who scaled the cliffs. The terrain is still marked by the pockmarks of naval shelling. The remnants of bunkers and casemates stand in the condition left by the battle, while the cliffs bear the visible scars from that fateful morning in June 1944. Along the cliff edge, commemorative markers honor not only the Rangers who climbed the cliffs, but also soldiers of all nations who fought and died on D-Day. On June 6, 1984, President Ronald Reagan visited Pointe du Hoc to mark the 40th anniversary of the Normandy landings. Among the audience were 62 surviving members of the 2nd Ranger Battalion who had scaled the cliffs, many of whom had not returned to the site since the war. At the cliff's edge, Reagan addressed the veterans directly, recognizing their courage and sacrifice. These were the men who had seized the cliffs, contributed to liberating Europe, and helped bring the war to its conclusion. The lessons from Pointe du Hoc extended far beyond the immediate battlefield. The operation demonstrated the value of specialized, mission-specific training, proving that well-prepared troops could achieve objectives beyond the capabilities of conventional forces. The U.S. Army adopted the Ranger model permanently, and the modern 75th Ranger Regiment traces its lineage directly to the 2nd Ranger Battalion, with Pointe du Hoc recognized as a pivotal moment in Ranger history. Tactical innovations developed for the assault influenced military doctrine for decades. Yet the most enduring lesson was human, determined, disciplined soldiers with clear objectives could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. The following year, in 1985, more than 500 former Rangers gathered for a reunion at Fort Hood, Texas, many accompanied by their families. Despite decades of separation, the bonds formed on those cliffs remained strong. Colonel James Rudder, who had led the battalion and later served as president of Texas A&M University and Texas Land Commissioner, had passed away in 1970. His widow, Margaret Rudder, attended the reunion and spoke for him, noting that he rarely discussed Pointe du Hoc at home, but was proud of the battalion's accomplishments and deeply respectful of the men lost. First Sergeant Leonard Lomell, by then 65, delivered the keynote speech, capturing the Rangers' shared understanding of the mission. He reflected on the belief, shared by both the Rangers and their German opponents, that the assault was impossible. That miscalculation by the enemy proved decisive. Lomell concluded that impossible often merely signals a task requiring greater courage and resolve than expected. The statistics from Pointe du Hoc underscore the operation's severity. Of the 225 Rangers who landed, approximately 135 were killed or wounded during the two-day engagement, a casualty rate exceeding 60%, among the highest of any D-Day unit. The battalion maintained its positions for roughly 48 hours under isolation and heavy pressure, facing enemy forces ranging from a battalion to a regiment. The primary objective, the destruction of 6 155mm artillery pieces, was accomplished within about 3 hours of the landing, despite the guns having been relocated shortly before the assault. Remarkably, the mission's success hinged on the actions of just 2 men using thermite grenades, illustrating that decisive impact does not always require large numbers. By neutralizing the guns, the Rangers ensured that no American or Allied ships or landing craft suffered fire from that position, validating the mission's strategic necessity. The human cost extended beyond the initial engagement. Many Pointe du Hoc survivors later perished in subsequent operations as the 2nd Ranger Battalion advanced through France and into Germany, including the brutal fighting in the Hürtgen Forest. Despite this, the courage and determination demonstrated at Pointe du Hoc set a lasting standard for military professionalism and operational planning, proving that even the most formidable obstacles could be overcome by well-trained, resolute soldiers. On June 8th, only 90 members of the U.S. Rangers remained fully capable of combat, and fewer than 40 of them would survive the remainder of the war without serious injury. The actions at Pointe du Hoc left a profound legacy, shaping the ethos and tactics of today's Special Operations Forces. The 75th Ranger Regiment honors this history with a memorial at its headquarters, marking the site of Lieutenant Colonel James Earl Rudder's extraordinary leadership. Each graduating class of Rangers travels to Normandy as part of their training, pausing at the edge of the cliffs to observe the beaches below, a tangible reminder of the courage required there. The Ranger Creed, with its declaration, "I will never leave a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy," reflects a principle forged under relentless fire at Pointe du Hoc, where soldiers repeatedly risked their lives to recover wounded teammates. For the German defenders, Pointe du Hoc signaled a turning point. The Atlantic Wall, a massive defensive system that had consumed vast resources and manpower, was breached at one of its most heavily fortified points. The psychological blow to German troops across Normandy was immediate and severe. The 352nd and 716th Infantry Divisions, which had held the sector, were shattered in the days following D-Day, and by the end of June, both had effectively ceased to function as cohesive fighting units. The consequences of this operation extended far beyond a single battlefield. D-Day's overall success depended in large measure on missions like Pointe du Hoc. Had the Rangers failed to neutralize the artillery positions, those guns could have inflicted devastating losses on the troops landing at Omaha Beach, potentially altering the course of the invasion. Over the decades, the commemoration of Pointe du Hoc has become formalized and enduring. In 1979, the French government officially entrusted the site to the American Battle Monuments Commission, ensuring its perpetual care. Today, more than 400,000 visitors come annually to witness the cliffs and the memorial. The monument itself is understated yet poignant, a granite obelisk positioned atop the ruins of a German bunker, inscribed in both French and English. The English inscription notes that on June 6, 1944, elements of the 2nd U.S. Ranger Battalion scaled the 100-foot cliffs to destroy a German artillery battery capable of threatening the Omaha and Utah beach landings. The assault on Pointe du Hoc remains one of the most striking examples of tactical ingenuity and extraordinary bravery in World War II. The mission succeeded because the Rangers refused to accept the impossibility of the task. The Germans had accurately judged the cliffs to be almost insurmountable from the sea, yet they underestimated the training, determination, and strategic acumen of the Rangers. Those Rangers trusted in their preparation and capability, even as the cost of success proved devastating. Ultimately, all 6 guns were destroyed, a key coastal highway was cut, and the invasion of Normandy proceeded, though at the expense of 135 men killed or wounded. The story of Pointe du Hoc illustrates the transformation of the seemingly impossible into a hard-fought achievement. What began as an almost unassailable German strongpoint became a challenge met by careful planning, rigorous training, and extraordinary resolve. 225 Rangers faced sheer rock under enemy fire because they had been prepared for exactly that and understood the stakes of their mission. Survivors carried the memory of their fallen comrades into the decades that followed, feeling a growing responsibility to ensure the story endured. Today, the cliffs still stand, the memorial remains, and the legacy of those 225 men continues to inspire. With courage, discipline, and unwavering determination, no defensive position is truly impregnable,